Rust flakes from an auction block like dead skin. Harlan spits tobacco into dry dust, watching a grieving woman bid on a gutted tractor and bent subsoiler. Snorts of laughter ripple through an impatient crowd. Harlan shakes his head. Certain grief shattered her mind. He is entirely, fundamentally wrong. August in the valley didn't just heat the air. It baked the moisture out of a man's lungs. Harlan stood near the back of the auction lot, shifting his weight off his bad left knee. The gravel crunched under his work boots, a dry, hollow sound that echoed the general mood of the county. The bank was liquidating the Miller place today. Next week, it might be the Henderson farm. Soon enough, folks figured it would be Martha's turn. Martha stood 10 yards away, a solitary figure in a sea of faded denim and sweat-stained caps. She wore her late husband's canvas coat despite the 80-degree heat, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. George had been in the ground barely 6 months. Massive coronary in the tractor cab left her with 400 acres of compacted clay, a mountain of debt, and a deafening silence in a farmhouse built for a family they never managed to start. Tommy, the auctioneer, droned through the microphone, his voice a rhythmic, nasal hum that blurred into the background hum of cicadas. He was trying to offload a row of dead equipment. "Lot 42, Tommy called, wiping his forehead with a greasy rag. "Got a heavy-duty subsoiler. Looks like a John Deere frame, but somebody's ripped the tags off. Hydraulics are shot. Shanks are bent. Good for scrap weight. Do I hear 50? It was a rusted carcass of a machine. It sat in the weeds, its heavy steel frame flaking orange and brown. The shanks, thick steel blades meant to rip deep into the earth, were twisted like arthritic fingers. It was useless. Every farmer in the county knew that to farm this valley, you needed a moldboard plow to turn the topsoil, to make it fluffy and clean. You didn't drag an anchor through the hardpan. $50, a voice croaked. Harlan blinked. The crowd turned. Martha had her hand raised. Her face was pale, devoid of makeup, the deep lines around her mouth set like poured concrete. Tommy hesitated. He knew George. Everyone knew George. "I got 50 from Martha. Do I hear 60? 60. A scrapper from 2 towns over barked, grinning. He just wanted the iron to melt down. 200, Martha said. The scrapper dropped his hand. The crowd went dead silent, save for the hum of the cicadas. A few men exchanged glances. Someone in the front let out a low, derisive snort. $200 for a rusted piece of junk when everyone knew the bank was already breathing down her neck. "Sold," Tommy said softly, hitting his gavel against a truck tailgate. 200 to the widow. Harlan rubbed his jaw, feeling the prickle of gray stubble. He limped over to her as the crowd shuffled toward the next lot. He smelled the faint odor of stale coffee and old wool on her. "Martha," Harlan said, keeping his voice low, "what in God's name are you doing? You can't pull that monster with George's old tractor, and even if you could, it won't do nothing but tear up your transmission." Martha didn't look at him. She was staring at the rusted subsoiler, her eyes tracking the lines of the bent steel. "George always said the hardpan was the problem," Harlan said. "The roots hit a brick wall 8 inches down." "George said a lot of things over a beer," Harlan replied, trying to sound gentle, though his voice naturally held the grit of sandpaper. "But he plowed like the rest of us, because that's what works. You need topsoil. You drag that thing through your fields, you're just going to churn up clods the size of engine blocks." "I'm not going to churn," Martha said quietly. She finally turned to him. Her eyes weren't the wet, tragic eyes of a grieving widow. They were dry, hard. "I'm going to slice." Harlan sighed, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice near the tire of a broken combine. "You're throwing good money after bad. The bank won't care about your slicing when the note comes due in November. Let me rent your east quarter. I'll give you a fair price. It'll keep the wolves off the porch." It was a generous offer. Harlan didn't need the extra land. His joints ached enough managing his own spread. He was doing it for George. Martha walked past him. "I'm not renting, Harlan, and I'm not selling. I'll borrow a trailer to haul this back by tonight." Harlan watched her walk away, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. He felt a flash of irritation. Pity was a heavy thing to carry for someone who refused to hold up their end of it. The men at the feed store were already laughing. Widow's folly, they'd call it. Let her learn the hard way, he thought. The earth doesn't care about your grief. It only cares about the plow. By December, the valley had turned into a frozen, gray bowl. The wind howled down from the northern ridge, rattling the tin roofs of the barns and driving the cold so deep into your bones that hot coffee felt like a temporary lie. Harlan hadn't spoken to Martha in weeks. He saw her truck, occasionally, parked outside the local hardware store, bed loaded with angle iron and cutting wheels. Tonight, sitting in his armchair with the local paper, he couldn't concentrate. His wife, Sarah, had made a venison stew. She had silently packed a Tupperware container, set it on the counter, and stared at Harlan until he grunted, put his boots back on, and grabbed his coat. He drove his truck the half-mile down the county road to Martha's place. The farmhouse was dark, not a single light on in the kitchen, but the barn at the back of the property was glowing. It wasn't a steady light. It was the sharp, violent, stroboscopic flash of an arc welder. Blue-white lightning bleeding through the gaps in the warped wooden siding. Harlan parked, grabbing the warm container of stew. As he approached the barn door, the smells hit him. Ozone, melting steel, the harsh chemical sting of burning flux, mixed with the underlying scent of old diesel and mouse droppings. He pushed the side door open. The temperature inside was barely above freezing, except for the localized hellfire in the center of the concrete floor. Martha was kneeling beside the rusted subsoiler she had bought months ago. It was propped up on heavy wooden blocks. She wore George's leather welding apron, which swallowed her frame, and a heavy helmet plastered with fading stickers. She was running a bead along one of the shanks. Or trying to. Harlan watched silently. He wasn't a master fabricator, but he knew enough to see she was struggling. The arc sputtered, popping loudly like a string of cheap firecrackers. Sparks rained down on her jeans. She was pushing the rod too fast, breaking the arc, striking it again in frustration. Suddenly, a blob of molten slag popped from the weld, landing directly on her exposed left wrist, just above her leather glove. Martha shrieked, a raw, guttural sound. She dropped the stinger. The live electrode hit the grounded metal frame, throwing a shower of sparks before sticking fast and humming angrily. Martha ripped her helmet off, grabbing her wrist, her chest heaving. She didn't cry. Instead, she picked up a heavy ball-peen hammer from the floor and swung it wildly at the machine. Metal clanged against metal, a deafening, ringing crack. She hit it again, and again, screaming a string of profanities that would have made a sailor blush, cursing the machine, cursing the bank, cursing George for dying in the dirt and leaving her alone in it. Harlan stood frozen in the shadows. He felt like an intruder, violating a profoundly ugly, private moment. He should have stepped back, closed the door, and left the stew on the porch. But his boot scraped against the concrete. Martha froze. She whipped around, chest rising and falling rapidly, her graying hair plastered to her forehead with sweat despite the cold. She saw him, the anger in her eyes fractured, replaced instantly by a brittle, defensive pride. Door was open. Harlan lied roughly, holding up the Tupperware. Sarah made too much dinner. Martha stared at him, then looked down at her wrist. A red, angry blister was already forming. She tossed the hammer onto a workbench, put it on the barrel. Harlan walked forward, setting the container down. He looked at the machine. It was a Frankenstein's monster. She had used a cutting torch to sever the wide, traditional sweeps from the bottom of the shanks. In their place, she was welding on narrow, wedge-like points she had fabricated from hardened steel. "Those beads look like pigeon droppings, Martha," Harlan said. He didn't say it to be cruel. He said it because it was a fact, and farmers trafficked in facts. "They'll hold," she muttered, grabbing a wire brush and furiously scrubbing the slag off her recent attempt. It was porous and ugly. "I'm not entering it in a beauty pageant." "You're making them too narrow," Harlan said, pointing a thick, calloused finger at the modified shanks. "You pull that through the field, it ain't gonna turn the soil over. It's just gonna slice a groove. The weeds will choke out your seed before June." "Good," Martha snapped. "Let the weeds stay on top." Harlan shook his head. "You're crazy. You leave the residue on top. The soil won't warm up. The seed will rot." George knew better than this. "George is dead." Martha's voice cracked like a whip. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the hum of the transformer on the welder. She looked down, tracing the ugly weld with a gloved finger. George plowed every year, turned the dirt over nice and black, and every year the tractor worked harder and the yield got smaller. We made a hard pan beneath the topsoil so thick a pickaxe bounces off it. Roots can't go down, so when the rain stops, the crops die. That's just farming, Martha. It's the weather. No, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, trembling whisper. It's a habit, a bad habit. I'm going to rip a slot through that concrete. I'm going to drop the seed in the slot, and I'm going to leave the dead stalks on top to shade the ground. I don't care how ugly it looks. Harlan looked at the bruised, burned woman standing in a freezing barn, defending a machine that looked guaranteed to fail. He felt a profound, heavy sadness for her. The bank manager was at the diner this morning, Harlan said quietly. He's giving you until after harvest. If you don't clear the arrears, they're taking the farm. Rent me the land, Martha, please. Martha picked up the stinger, snapping it sideways to break the stuck rod loose. She pulled her helmet down over her face, her voice muffled behind the dark visor. Thanks for the stew, Harlan. Close the door on your way out. The blinding blue light struck again, forcing Harlan to look away. He walked out into the biting winter wind, the sound of sputtering electricity echoing behind him. Spring came late, bringing a teasing drizzle that barely settled the dust before evaporating into the warming air. April meant planting season. It was the only time of year Harlan genuinely felt young. Sitting in the cab of his heavy Case IH tractor, pulling a six-bottom moldboard plow, Harlan felt a sense of order return to the world. The massive steel blades cut into the earth, lifting a ribbon of soil and rolling it over, burying last year's corn stalks and exposing the rich, dark, fragrant underbelly of the land. The smell of turned earth was intoxicating, a mix of damp minerals and the promise of life. Behind his tractor, the field looked like a vast expanse of neat, brown corduroy. It was beautiful. It was right. He reached the end of his row near the property line he shared with Martha, lifting the hydraulic levers. The plow raised, clanking heavily. As he turned the steering wheel to swing the tractor around, he paused, idling the engine. Across the barbed wire fence, Martha was making her first pass. It was a painful thing to watch. She was driving George's old, faded two-wheel drive tractor. Behind it was the rusted, scarred monstrosity she had spent the winter welding. Harlan rolled his window down. The sound hit him first. Her tractor wasn't humming. It was screaming. The diesel engine was lugging down, bellowing thick, black smoke into the crisp spring air. The exhaust stack rattled violently. She dropped the implement into the earth. The narrow shanks pierced the ground. The tractor immediately bogged down, the large rear tires spinning in the dry topsoil, whining against the load. Martha slammed the clutch, threw it into a lower gear, and engaged it again. The tractor lurched forward, fighting for every inch. Harlan watched the dirt behind her machine. It was a mess. Unlike Harlan's neat, inverted rows, Martha's field looked exactly as it had an hour ago, covered in the rotting, pale yellow stubble of last year's harvest. The only difference was a series of thin, ragged slits running through the debris. She wasn't turning the earth. She was dragging a knife through a corpse. At the diner the next morning, the coffee was bitter, and the mood was smug. "Seen the widow's field?" Bill, a heavy-set farmer from the North Ridge, asked, pouring sugar into his mug. "Looks like she let a pack of wild dogs dig through a garbage dump." Laughter rumbled through the booths. "She's doing trash farming," another man chimed in. "No-till deep ripping. Read about it in some shiny magazine, probably. Works great if you got 10 feet of loam in Iowa. Out here, the clay is going to bake that seed like an oven. She'll be lucky to get 20 bushels an acre." Harlan sat at the corner booth, staring at his eggs. He didn't laugh. He felt a knot of anxiety in his gut. He knew they were probably right. Farming wasn't about reinventing the wheel. It was about survival. But the mockery felt cheap. "She's trying something," Harlan grunted, not looking up. "More than you lazy sons of bitches do. You've been planting the same hybrid corn for 10 years and complaining about the yield." The table went quiet. Bill scoffed. "All right, Harlan. You be her white knight. We'll see who's laughing when the bank auctions her house in November." That evening, the restlessness took Harlan again. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The air was cooling rapidly. Harlan parked his truck on the shoulder of the county road, right beside Martha's field. He climbed over the low fence, his bad knee throbbing, and walked into her property. It felt terrible underfoot. Instead of the soft, sinking feeling of freshly plowed topsoil, his boots crunched over old, dry stalks and hard dirt. It felt neglected, abandoned. He walked to one of the thin slits her machine had carved. He knelt down, grimacing as his joints popped. He pulled a heavy pocket knife from his denim jacket and jammed it into the side of the slit. The first 4 inches were dry, crumbly dirt, but as he dug deeper, past the 8-inch mark where the plow pan usually stopped him like a sheet of plywood, the blade met resistance, then broke through. He dug his bare fingers into the gash, pushing past the sharp edges of the fractured hardpan. He paused. Harlan rubbed his thumb and index finger together. He brought his hand to his face. It was faint, masked by the smell of dry dust, but it was there. Moisture. The dirt from the bottom of the slit was slightly tacky, cold. The deep, narrow shank had shattered the compacted layer, and underneath, the earth was holding onto the winter melt. Harlan stood up slowly, wiping his dirty hand on his jeans. He looked out over the ugly, debris-covered field. It still looked like a disaster. It violated every instinct he had developed over 50 years of staring at the sun and praying for rain. But as the wind picked up, rustling the dead stalks that blanketed the unplowed ground, Harlan felt a cold sliver of doubt pierce his absolute certainty. What if she wasn't crazy? By July, the valley stopped pretending. The heat did not rise and fall with the sun. It settled over the county like a physical weight, pressing the breath out of every living thing. Rain simply ceased to exist as a concept. The sky turned a pale, bleached blue, empty of clouds, empty of mercy. Harlan drove his truck with the windows down, the hot air blowing through the cab, feeling like the exhaust of a furnace. He tasted grit. Fine, powdery topsoil coated his teeth and settled deep in the creases of his neck. He pulled up to the edge of his South 40. He didn't bother turning off the engine. The rhythmic, uneven idle of the V8 was the only sound for miles. His field was dying. It was a slow, agonizing execution. The beautiful, clean rows he had plowed in April were now concrete. The sun had baked the exposed black earth into jagged, polygon slabs, separated by cracks wide enough to swallow a man's hand. He stepped out of the truck, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. He walked into the rows. The corn stalks were barely chest high. They should have been towering over his head by now. The leaves were rolling tight, curling in on themselves to conserve whatever microscopic moisture remained. It was a defense mechanism farmers called pineappling. It meant the plant was suffocating. It meant the roots were pulling up nothing but hot air. Harlan grabbed a stalk and pulled. It snapped at the base with a dry, hollow crack. He kicked the dirt. It didn't yield. The roots of his corn had grown down 6 inches, hit the plow pan, the compacted layer of clay he and his father and his grandfather had created by decades of heavy plowing, and stopped. Unable to penetrate the hard pan, the roots had grown sideways, weaving through the topsoil. Now, that topsoil was an oven. The moisture was gone. He threw the dead stalk into the dirt. A sickening, hollow feeling settled in his stomach. The bank didn't just hold Martha's note, they held his, too. He had equity, sure, but a total crop failure would eat his savings down to the marrow. He drove to the diner that afternoon. The parking lot was full, but the inside was quiet. Bill sat at the counter, stirring a lukewarm cup of coffee. He looked 10 years older than he had in the spring. The smugness was completely gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of a man calculating bankruptcy. Harlan sat 2 stools down. "How's the North Ridge?" "Powder," Bill rasped. "I'm chopping it for silage tomorrow. Maybe get enough to feed the cows through winter. There ain't no ears on the stalks. It's just paper." Nobody laughed at the widow anymore. They didn't have the energy. Survival had stripped away the luxury of gossip. Harlan ordered a water, drank it in one long pull, and left. He drove the long way home, taking the county road that bordered Martha's property. He slowed down as he approached her fence line. He hit the brakes, throwing the truck into park on the shoulder. Dust swirled past his headlights in the fading evening sun. He stared. Martha's field was not a disaster. It was green. It wasn't a pristine, dark emerald green. It was a dusty, muted olive. But the stalk stood tall, rising a full 2 feet higher than Harlan's. The leaves were broad and flat, soaking up the dying sunlight. They were not curled. They were not screaming for water. Harlan climbed the fence. He didn't care if he was trespassing. He needed to understand. He walked into the dense rows. The air immediately felt different here. It was cooler. The biting wind that scoured his own fields was broken by the sheer mass of the stalks. He looked down. The ground was a mess of decaying, gray debris. Last year's corn stalks, rotting husks, and dead weeds formed a thick, tangled mat over the soil. It was hideous. It looked like a neglected roadside ditch. Harlan dropped to his bad knee. He pushed his fingers through the layers of dead vegetation. The heat of the day vanished. Underneath the rotting trash, the soil was shielded from the baking sun. The residue acted like a thick wool blanket, trapping the cool air against the earth. He dug deeper, his calloused fingers finding the narrow slit Martha had ripped through the field with her rusted subsoiler. He pushed his hand down into the groove. 8 inches, 10 inches, a foot. His fingers came up damp. The moisture wasn't abundant, but it was there. The winter snowmelt and the meager spring rains had funneled down into the deep, shattered slots she had cut into the hardpan. Because she hadn't flipped the soil over with a plow, the water hadn't evaporated. It had stayed locked deep underground, safe in the dark. Harlan pulled a pocket knife and dug carefully around the base of one of her corn stalks. He exposed the root mass. It didn't fan out horizontally like his. It plunged straight down, a thick, white taproot chasing the moisture directly through the fracture in the clay, drinking from a reservoir his own crops couldn't reach. He sat back on his heels in the dirt, breathing heavily. The smell of damp earth and growing green things filled his nose. It was a smell he hadn't experienced in weeks. She had broken the rules. She had taken a piece of junk meant for the scrap heap, mutilated it to serve her desperate needs, and left her field looking like a garbage dump. And she had outsmarted every man in the valley. Harlan stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from his jeans. A heavy, complicated emotion washed over him. It wasn't jealousy. It was a profound, humbling realization of his own obsolescence. He had farmed the way his father taught him, confusing tradition with truth. Martha had farmed out of raw terror, listening only to the brutal mechanics of dirt and water. Terror had won. September did not bring relief. It brought a dry, suffocating wind that carried the pulverized remains of a ruined county. The dust hanging in the air was thick, yellow, and abrasive. It smelled of diesel exhaust and crushed, dead vegetation. It coated the throat. It made the eyes water. Harlan ran his massive red Case IH combine through his fields for 2 grueling days. It was a depressing, mechanical chore. The massive header chewed through the brittle stalks, the rotary cutters snapping the dry corn with sounds like breaking bones, but the grain tank behind the cab filled at an agonizing crawl. The ears of corn the machine pulled in were pathetic, stunted things, missing half their kernels, shriveled by a summer spent baking in a clay oven. When he finally pulled his semi-truck up onto the rusted steel plates of the local grain elevator, the weigh scale confirmed his deep, cold dread. 42 bushels an acre. It was a catastrophic failure. It was barely enough to cover the cost of the red diesel fuel it took to plant and harvest the field, let alone pay the note at the bank, the property taxes, or the seed bill for next spring. Harlan sat in the cab of his truck, staring at the printed slip of paper the scale operator handed him. The numbers blurred. He felt old. His bad knee throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that traveled all the way up to his jaw. He parked his truck near the edge of town and walked the 2 blocks to the diner. He couldn't stomach the thought of going home to Sarah just yet. He couldn't face the quiet, terrible conversation across the linoleum kitchen table about which tractor they would have to sell, or if they needed to tap into the retirement account just to keep the lights on through January. The diner was packed. Men sat in vinyl booths with black dirt under their fingernails and red-rimmed, hollow eyes. A few bankmen in crisp, short-sleeved dress shirts sat at a corner table, drinking ice water. Their presence was heavy, silent, and predatory. "She's cutting today," someone mumbled from the counter. Harlan looked up from his black coffee. The liquid tasted burnt, sour on his tongue. Bill was sitting 2 stools down, staring out the grease-smudged front window toward the county road. "Martha," Bill said, his voice entirely flat, devoid of its usual booming confidence. "Rented that old yellow New Holland from the co-op, the one with the bad alternator. She's in her east field right now." Nobody made a joke. Nobody talked about trash farming or widow's folly. A silent, morbid curiosity settled over the room, heavy as the dust outside. One by one, men pushed away half-eaten sandwiches, left crumpled dollar bills on the counter, and walked out to their trucks. Harlan followed. He drove with the windows rolled up, the AC struggling to cut through the oppressive heat. He parked a half-mile down from Martha's property. The shoulder of the gravel road was already lined with a dozen dusty pickups. Men stood leaning against their tailgates, arms crossed over their chests, hats pulled low against the blowing grit. Out in the field, the faded yellow combine roared. It was an older, smaller machine than Harlan's, a relic from the late 90s, and it sounded like it was dying. Black, sooty smoke puffed from the exhaust stack in ragged, rhythmic bursts. Martha sat in the cab, a tiny, dark silhouette behind the dust-caked glass. She was pushing the machine hard. Too hard, Harlan thought initially. He walked to the fence line, stopping next to Bill. The air blowing off the field smelled intensely of ruptured stalks and the sweet, starchy scent of raw grain dust. "Listen to that engine," Bill said quietly, wiping a layer of grit from his forehead. "She's bogging it down, running the rotor too fast." "She's not running fast," Harlan said. His voice felt like gravel in his own throat. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the combine's large front tires. "Look at her ground speed. She's barely in second gear. She's crawling." Bill frowned, squinting through the dust, his eyes tracking the machine. "Then why is the rotor whining like a wounded dog? It sounds completely choked." The combine reached the end of the row, near the edge of the county road. The massive machine lurched forward and stopped as Martha disengaged the header. She swung the long, rusted metal unloading auger out from the side of the combine. An old, dented grain cart hitched to George's faded two-wheel drive tractor waited at the edge of the field, operated by a high school kid she must have hired for the day. Martha engaged the unloading auger. The sound shifted. It wasn't the metallic pinging of a few stray kernels hitting the bottom of an empty steel cart. It wasn't a thin trickle. It was a violent roar. A thick, heavy, unbroken torrent of deep, golden corn cascaded from the spout. It fell with a massive, rushing weight, slamming into the metal cart and piling up in the center in a matter of seconds. The dust blowing off the grain was thick and white, catching the late afternoon sun like a halo. The pile grew furiously, spilling toward the steep edges of the cart, a towering mountain of heavy yellow kernels. The men standing on the shoulder of the road went dead silent. The only sound in the county was the deafening, rushing roar of the falling grain and the throbbing, strained diesel engine of the New Holland. Harlan watched the grain pouring out, his breath caught in his throat. He knew the math. Every man on that road knew the math, by sight alone. You could tell a field's yield by how long the auger ran, by how thick the stream was, by how fast the tires on the grain cart squatted under the sudden, massive weight. The auger ran for 3 full minutes. The cart was nearly overflowing, kernels bouncing over the sides into the dirt. Martha shut off the hydraulic flow. The stream choked and stopped. She folded the auger back against the combine, dropped the header, throttled up the engine, and turned back into the field. She had barely covered 4 acres, and her grain tank had been completely full. "Good God," a man muttered behind Harlan, the words slipping out like a prayer. "That's," Bill stammered. His thick hands gripped the rusted barbed wire fence tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. The barbs dug into his palms, but he didn't seem to notice. "That's 150 bushels, maybe more. In this drought, in this dirt, it's more," Harlan said. His chest felt incredibly tight, a heavy pressure sitting right over his sternum. "It's closer to 200. She had tripled the county average. She had tripled it in a year when the sky had offered nothing but fire, and the earth had turned to concrete. By late afternoon, the line of semi-trucks waiting to haul her grain to the elevator stretched a quarter-mile down the gravel road. The town hadn't just come to watch. A few of the men, unprompted and without saying a single word to her, had driven their own empty, expensive trucks over to help her haul. They backed their trailers under her auger, took her grain to town, and brought the way tickets back. It was a silent apology, spoken in horsepower, hauling capacity, and burnt diesel. Harlan didn't bring his truck. He just waited. He waited until the sun finally dipped below the ridge, painting the lingering dust clouds in bruised shades of purple and violent, burnt orange. The old yellow combine finally shut down in the dead center of the field. The sudden, absolute silence was shocking, leaving a high-pitched ringing in Harlan's ears. He unlatched the wire gate and walked out into the freshly cut stalks. The ground under his boots was still littered with the ugly, rotting trash of last year, now thickly mixed with the shattered stalks of this year's massive harvest. It was a chaotic, hideous mess of dead vegetation. It looked like a landfill. It was the most beautiful thing Harlan had ever seen. He reached the combine just as the heavy glass cab door popped open. Martha climbed down the metal ladder. She moved terrifyingly slow. She moved like a woman whose bones had been replaced with lead, like someone who had been beaten repeatedly with a sack of wet sand. Her husband's heavy canvas coat was long gone. She wore a faded gray t-shirt that was entirely soaked through with sweat, clinging to her thin frame. Her face was coated in a thick, dark layer of black dust, grease, and dried sweat, turning the deep wrinkles around her mouth and eyes into sharp, harsh canyons. She reached the bottom metal rung and stepped off. Her boots hit the soft dirt. Instantly, her knees buckled. Harlan lunged forward, his bad knee screaming in protest. He caught her by the arm just before she pitched face first into the dirt. She felt impossibly light beneath the grime, fragile as a bird's wing. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge him. She turned her head, leaned heavily over his supporting arm, and violently dry-heaved into the dust. Her shoulders shook with brutal, terrifying spasms. She coughed, a wet, rattling sound, spitting bitter bile into the cornstalks. She wasn't celebrating. There was no triumph here. The pure chemical adrenaline that had kept her moving, welding in the freezing dark, fighting the hardened earth, and ignoring the sneering mockery of the entire county for 8 months, had simply evaporated. The terror of the bank manager, the suffocating grief of an empty farmhouse, the sheer, crushing physical exhaustion, it all collapsed on her at the exact same moment. Harlan held her up. He didn't speak. He just gripped her thin bicep, his large, calloused hand, steadying her as her body betrayed her. He smelled old sweat, heavy diesel fumes, and the sour tang of exhaustion. After a long, agonizing minute, the shivering subsided. She stopped heaving. She wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling, grease-stained hand and slowly, painfully stood upright, pulling away from his grip. She leaned back against the massive, dusty front tire of the combine, closing her eyes. Her chest rose and fell in ragged, shallow breaths. "The bankman called," she whispered. Her voice was completely destroyed, barely a scrape of sound over the evening wind. Elevator faxed him the way tickets from the first 10 loads. Harlan reached into his denim jacket, pulled out a relatively clean blue cotton handkerchief, and handed it to her. "What did he say?" Martha took the cloth, pressing it hard against her forehead, leaving a dark smudge of grease on the fabric. She opened her eyes. They were bloodshot, exhausted beyond human limits, but entirely devoid of fear. "He asked if I wanted to buy the Henderson place," she said flatly, staring past Harlan at the horizon. "Said they're foreclosing on them next Tuesday." Harlan let out a low, rough exhale. The Henderson place bordered his own north field, the very same field that had yielded 42 bushels this morning. He looked around the ugly, debris-covered earth. He looked at the thick, green stalks lying in the dirt, heavy with massive ears of corn. Then, he looked back toward the farmhouse in the distance, where the rusted, mangled, heavily welded subsoiler sat parked by the barn. He felt a deep, uncomfortable tectonic shift in his chest. It was the painful, total shattering of a lifetime of pride. Decades of his father's stern lectures about clean rows and turning the black earth over to the sun, all proven wrong by a desperate widow with a scrap metal blade. "Martha," Harlan said. His voice was thick with dust and a very new, very reluctant humility. "Next week, after you get your checks cleared at the bank, I need you to show me how you welded those shanks." Martha finally looked at him. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't have the energy for it. And the dirt didn't care about told-you-sos anyway. She just handed him his dirt-stained handkerchief back. "Bring your own welding rods, Harlan," she said, turning to grip the ladder rungs once more. "And you owe me a Tupperware." Harlan stood in the dirt, watching her slowly pull herself up the ladder. The combine roared back to life, the heavy diesel engine shaking the earth beneath his work boots. He turned and walked back toward the road, stepping carefully over the rotting trash that had saved the farm, finally learning how to let go of the plow. If this gritty story of resilience hit home for you, hit that like button, share it with someone fighting their own uphill battle, and subscribe to the channel for more raw, grounded storytelling. Leave a comment below. Would you have risked it all on a rusted machine? Let us know.